Hi everybody, welcome to today's lecture on global humanitarianism and on inequalities. Today we'll be first looking at inequalities, how they relate to globalization, how does globalization affect inequality worldwide. So we'll start at looking how we even measure inequality, how do we understand inequality, and we'll then move to have a look at global inequality currently. Has it been on the increase, has it decreased? What types of global inequality do we see in the world right now? And we'll then move a bit more specifically into three types of discriminations that affect inequality and that have been affected by globalization. So we'll look at the rural-urban divide and how that has been impacted by globalization. We'll look how racial and ethnic inequality has been affected by globalization, and we'll also look at how gender inequality has been affected by globalization. That's the first part. In the second part, we'll look at global humanitarianism. So we'll look at different forms of aid that have been used throughout the world and throughout time. We'll mostly focus on what is called official development assistance, ODA, which is the main type of foreign aid that has been used. And we'll finalize on South-South cooperation, which is a more recent form of cooperation that has been growing quite a lot over the past years. Okay, so let's get started. Now, why do we talk about inequality with relation to globalization? On the one hand, really because inequality is one of the most pressing problems of nowadays world, and it has been on a constant rise. There are some scholars that argue that inequality has been decreasing, but according to most policymakers, according to most academics, and also according to most statistics, inequality has been rising a lot, especially over the past decade. It is mainly considered that economic globalization is the major contributor to global inequality, meaning that the free market, the neoliberal system, and also the economic institutions like the World Trade Organization, the IMF, the World Bank, that have been pushing for neoliberal economic globalization have contributed to this inequality and to some countries and some populations getting much, much poorer, while others have been able to accumulate more and more wealth. So according to the Oxfam report of 2017, the richest 8 people own as much as the bottom 50% of the world's population. And these numbers have really been increasing. A few years ago, it was still the richest 62 people. Now it's already the richest 8. So it really is almost like on the picture. Now, it's often we think that inequality only affects the poor, right? It only affects the discriminated, the people that suffer from it. But inequality is really something that puts the whole planet in danger because it is a source of instability and of conflict. Because inequality sort of forces people to migrate sometimes for better jobs. It sometimes forces people to protest for better jobs, for better healthcare, for better education. So it obviously, the higher the inequality, the more it is linked to violence. And you can even look at statistics. It is quite interesting to see how inequality in a country is often linked to very high levels of violence. So it is really, it should be a concern for everybody, not only for the losing side. Now, how do we measure inequality? There are many ways to measure inequality, and each one provides a different angle and serves a different purpose. So it's important to understand what information they can provide and what information they can't provide, and to know different ones so that we can actually use them depending on what we want to find out. So the main measurement that is used is the GDP per capita, which is basically the yearly output of a whole country divided by the population, right? So it basically gives you an average income in a given country. So this is useful to compare countries, right? Because it basically gives us an idea of the living standard of country A compared to country B. It has the disadvantage that it is an average, right? So sometimes it does not show the full picture. Like you have countries like, for example, Equatorial Guinea, that might show a rather high GDP per capita. So one could assume that it's a well-off country. But if you look closer, you see that there is a very small, very, very wealthy elite that lifts up the average. And that sort of covers up for the very, very poor population that is also present in the country. So it is a measure that sort of allows us to compare living standards in different countries, but we have to be very careful because it can cover up for inequality within the country. So another way of breaking it down a bit more is the GDP per group. So that's basically also doing a GDP per capita, but looking at it only for a group. So for example, you can look at the average income of the top 10% of a population in a given country and compare them to the bottom 10%, for example. So that gives you an idea of the inequality in the country. That's basically what the Oxfam report did that we saw in the slide before, right? Where you compare the income of 8 people with that of the whole population of the world, basically. So this is the GDP. Another very well-known measurement for inequality is the Gini index, or also Gini coefficient. It is basically a measure, it basically measures the distribution of income. It can also be used to measure the distribution of wealth in a society. So be careful not to confuse the two. Income is what one makes, like the money that one earns through a job. Wealth is what you possess, right? So there you also have your houses, your cars, anything that one, your businesses, your shareholding. So anything, stock market, anything that one possesses. So generally the Gini index looks at income. And it ranges from 0 to 1. So a Gini that is close to 0 means that we have a very equal society. A Gini that is very close to 1 means that we have a very unequal society. Sometimes it's also used from 0 to 100, but generally you will see the numbers ranging from 0 to 1. Another measure is the Human Development Index that was developed by the economist Amartya Sen, and it's very widely used by the UN. The HDI measures the per capita income, so basically like the GDP per capita, but it also adds life expectancy and access to education. So it is basically an index that looks at those three because it considers that income, health basically, and education are the three most important factors that can sort of give an idea of the level of the living standard in a country. So it is also an index that is used very widely to compare countries mainly. And then as a last one that I think can also be interesting to know is the PPP, the purchasing power parity. That's basically a way of comparing currencies of different countries through a basket of goods. So you basically look at, in country A, how much can I buy with this currency compared to country B, right? And you can even break it down to a product, like how much do you pay for a Big Mac in one country, how much do you pay for another one? And the Big Mac index is actually an index as well. So that sort of gives you an idea of how much people can buy with the money that they actually have available. So it also includes the currency and how strong the currency is. Okay, now here we have an example of the Gini index. As I said, it's the most important measurement of inequality. So as you can see here, you have the ranging. South Africa, Namibia, as you can see, are the darkest ones. So it's the countries with the most inequality currently. Brazil used to be in the top as well, but as you can see, it's a bit lighter now. So there have been efforts to decrease inequality that seem to be at least a bit successful. As you can see, the Northern European countries like Sweden, Norway, Denmark are the lightest ones, are the ones that are the most equal. But you also see that Eastern Europe is quite low in terms of inequality. And then you have some countries, mainly conflict-struck countries, that have no data available. Okay, now there's obviously inequality within country, which is generally what the Gini index shows you, but there's also inequalities between countries, right, among countries in the world system. And there's one very important theory that was developed that is called the world system theory, and it basically looks at how different countries depend from each other and are more or less exploited by other countries, and how that affects inequality within the global system. So according to world system theory, the world is divided into three. You have the core, which is like the wealthy industrialized countries that are the ones that promote or promoted the neoliberal system. So that's basically what we understand as the West, right? The US, Europe, basically. Then you have the semi-periphery, which is sort of the in-between, which is the developing economies like Brazil, like China, like India, like South Africa. It's basically like the BRICS countries fall into that section, and also a few other countries. And then you have the third part, that is the periphery, that are basically the countries that are on the outskirts of the economic system, which are the poorer countries. And it's often the countries that have entered the neoliberal system last. So it's countries that have joined the current international trade last and are therefore worse off. So what Wallerstein, who is the guy who invented who put up the theory, what he argues is that the position of a country within this world system really determines its powers. It determines how it depends from other countries, and it also determines its ability to develop its economy. So basically what he argues is that if you're in the periphery, if you're one of the poor countries, it is very difficult to develop your economy and to actually break out of that structure and move into the next, basically move into a semi-periphery, or from there move into the core. And he also argues that these power relations were established by colonial system, and that they continue to be in place through the global financial institutions like the IMF and like the World Bank. And he also argues that semi-periphery, like the countries in the semi-periphery, that they have a power over the periphery, but are still exploited by the core. So they're basically in between. And it was a theory that changed the understanding a lot, because it was one of the first theories that sort of also looked at how poverty has really been produced by global inequalities in trade and in finance systems as well, and how this is how the system sort of keeps certain countries in that place. So it has been a very controversial theory as well, because there's people who don't agree with it, but I think it gives a good understanding of current global inequalities. Here we see a map according to world system theory. So you see the countries in orange are part of what is considered the core. So it's basically Western countries plus Australia and China, who is slowly moving into there, and Japan, that is already in there. Then you have the semi-periphery, as we said, South Africa, Brazil, some other Latin American countries, Nigeria on the African continent. And then you have the periphery, which is really the countries that have the lowest living standards, that have the lowest economies. So if we look at the bottom billion, and the bottom billion is really the bottom, like the poorest billion of the world's population. If we look at that, 70% of the people of the bottom billion live in Africa. And this obviously poses big problems to the countries, because they face much lower life expectancy, they face higher infant mortality, there's often big issues of malnutrition, low incomes, lack of infrastructure, a big lack of access to internet and technology that then affects all the other areas as well. And there's often also more pollution and more e-waste, because corporate companies might be less responsible in terms of their pollution and in terms of their waste. And this situation has unfortunately really grown worse. So there are several factors that can sort of trap a country in a cycle of poverty. It's not the only ones, but it's 4 factors that are really dominant if you look at which countries are the most affected by poverty. So one big factor obviously is ongoing civil wars and ethnic conflict that affect the economy, they affect investment, they affect everyday life, they pretty much affect everything. And if they're ongoing over several years, they really trap a country in a cycle of poverty. A second factor is in many cases the richness in natural resources. And this for 2 reasons. One reason is that if there is one natural resource that is very dominant, like for example oil or gold or diamonds, a country's economy is very likely to focus completely or almost completely on that natural resource. And that makes the country's economy very dependent on one factor. So if prices of that good go down, the whole economy is affected widely because it is not a diversified economy that relies on several products and on several industries. So that's one reason. The other reason is obviously that often conflicts are linked to the presence of natural resources because you have different groups that want to possess the resources. You have outside influences from other countries as well that want to make sure that they have access, at least in part, to some of the resources. So those are two reasons that make this factor also an important one. Another important factor that can trap a country in a cycle of poverty is being a landlocked country with what you can call bad neighbors, right? So if you're a landlocked country, you obviously have pretty much no access to trade across the ocean. So you need to first have your goods transported through railway or by trucks to a port. So if you have surrounding countries that are not very stable or that might not have infrastructure, this can really affect the economy and the potential of how the economy can grow. It is different if the surrounding countries, like in the case of Switzerland, for example, Switzerland is landlocked as well, but the surrounding countries like Germany, Italy, France are stable economies, and there is a high level of cooperation in economic terms. So in that case, it doesn't have to be a negative factor. But in other cases, like Malawi, for example, is also a landlocked country and has economies around itself that are not necessarily that stable. So in that case, it can be a disadvantage. And then obviously another big factor is bad governance in general. So high levels of corruption or also just policies that are not functioning obviously affect a country, and they can affect in the long term, especially if they create a lot of debt that then affects the country for decades. Okay, so now looking a bit more into depth at three different types of inequalities. One type of divide or inequality is between rural and urban, and globalization has really increased that divide. On the one hand, because globalization has affected rural areas, particularly in poorer countries. On the one hand, because there's much more monocultures that often negatively affect the environment. And on the other hand, because also many agricultural areas have started to produce more for the global demands than actually for the local needs. So farmers might be producing products that are interesting for the global market or that are required from the global market, but they're not necessarily producing local products or products that would be needed locally. An example, for example, in Nicaragua is very strong on coffee, but within the countries, very few Nicaraguans are actually able to afford coffee because the coffee is of such high quality and most of it is exported. People in Nicaragua usually drink Nescoffee or the coffee or some mix that is not really coffee, and it does affect how the land is used, right? The same happens often with sugar, with cocoa, all of those products that take up a lot of space. Palm oil is another one. So globalization in respective to rural areas really has increased poverty in those areas. Now, regarding cities, cities have basically become the centers for globalization, right? You have world cities like New York, London, Tokyo, Shanghai that are increasingly globalized in terms of population, in terms of how they're linked into an international networks, in terms of trade, in terms of finances. So that's really where globalization has sort of monopolized wealth. And what's also interesting to see is that there is a trend towards cities being increasingly linked directly among themselves. So it's not necessarily trade between the US and the UK anymore. It might be trade directly between New York and London, or between New York and Tokyo. So that's also a trend that has sort of been pushed by globalization, and that obviously increases the divide between cities and between rural areas a lot. However, you also have an increase of mega cities, which are like massive cities with millions of people, that face huge problems, problems of overpopulation, of increasing urban slums, health issues, pollution, deteriorating infrastructure. So that's big cities that have had a lot of migration from rural areas and from other countries, and that are not able to actually cater for all the people that are coming to the city, and that also don't have enough jobs for all the people that are coming. Johannesburg is an example for this, right? The more you move to you have slums in the city center, but also the more you move to the outskirts, the more you have squatter camps of people, mostly that have migrated, and that the city is not actually able to provide for. So globalization has really increased the divide between rural and urban, and it has increased inequalities and made the situation worse for the rural areas. Okay, now looking at racial and ethnic inequalities, globalization has also increased racial and ethnic inequalities in some way, because you have much more diversity in many countries, because there is much more flow of people, because people are more mobile than what they used to 300 years ago. You have much more diverse countries, which often leads to more racism and more xenophobia. I think we've seen a lot of cases recently in the news from all over the world, where right-wing parties and racist speeches are sort of on the rise again. And what is also interesting to note is that many conflicts in the world in the past, but also current conflicts, are at least partly based on racial and ethnic differences. So an example, you obviously have apartheid, but also the Rwandan genocide between the Hutus and the Tutsis. The wars in ex-Yugoslavia were also ethnic wars. Nazi Germany was to some extent also almost an ethnic issue. So there are many cases of very strong conflicts that were at least partly based on racial and ethnic differences. And because we're growing more diverse globally, there is a potential for an increase of such conflicts worldwide, which is kind of scary. Just a quick note, in social sciences, race and ethnicity are considered social constructs. So it's considered that something that we have created as a society, that although you might have physical differences, the sort of what we attribute to a race or to a certain ethnicity is socially built. And it's also understood and defined differently in different parts of the world. And obviously, as we've seen in history and we still are seeing, it has also often been used to justify exploitation and the inequality of wealth and of power, sort of by defining one race as inferior to another. It was sort of okay to have a certain inequality in terms of wealth and of power, and we still see that. This is a map, just because I think it's interesting. This is a map of all the ethnic groups in Africa, on the African continent. So literally every color is a different ethnic group. Yeah, it's a lot. So just as a brief input. Okay, now I found a brief case study. It's an example of racial inequality in the USA, and it focuses on how race affects the access to wealth in the US, and how people of color, like either Black Americans or also Latinos, are affected, how their race affects their wealth and their chances of wealth in the US.
Dig deep into America's $17 trillion economy, and you'll find fractures beneath the surface. The spoils are split unevenly between men and women, old and young, high school dropouts, and MBAs. But one of the most divisive disparities is only skin deep. This is the economy in black and white. Everything you own, houses, stocks, cars, that's your wealth. In 2011, the wealth of the median white household was over $110,000. African Americans on average 17 times less, just over 6,000. And housing has a lot to do with it. For the average American, their home is the most valuable part of their portfolio. It's an investment that can appreciate with time, and it can be passed from one generation to the next. But the rate of homeownership among whites is 28% higher than that of blacks, and the lingering effects of segregation could be to blame. Discriminatory practices by the Federal Housing Authority prevented African Americans from buying houses in many suburban neighborhoods. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 sought to level the playing field. But by then, African Americans were entering a housing market that had already seen massive appreciation. Meanwhile, white families had seen their housing investment soar in value during their head start. Fast forward to the 21st century, minority groups were again victims of housing exploitation, this time by big banks. Bank of America and Wells Fargo, among others, were compelled to pay hundreds of millions of dollars in fines and restitution for pushing minorities into exploitative subprime mortgages and charging them higher rates and fees. This contributed to the fact that blacks and Hispanics lost nearly a quarter of their wealth between 2004 and 2010. Whites lost just 1% during that same period. So the American economy houses two realities, one black, one white. The divide between them, a measure of inequality.
Questions. You can either quickly think them through for yourself, or if you have someone next to you, discuss them. What main reasons does the CNN video mention for the racial inequality in terms of wealth in the USA? And also, what specific ways or what different ways of discrimination did you see in the video? Yeah, just quickly think about it. Okay, moving on. Another important type of inequality is gender inequality. Generally, globalization has rather reinforced pre-existing gender structures and barriers and sort of made them global. And we also see that most of the most devastating effects of economic globalization rather fall on women, particularly in less developed countries. So globalization for women has, on the one hand, which can be seen as positive, has led to a greater involvement of women in paid labor markets. So you have more women that are in the labor market, but especially in less developed countries and economies, women are mostly in very low paid manufacturing jobs with very poor working conditions, insufficient health and safety measures, unpaid overtime, abuse, violence, and often sexual harassment as well. So it comes with the two, right? On the one hand, we have more women that have paid labor, but on the other hand, the conditions are often worse for women than they are for men. Globalization has also, or actually this greater involvement of women in paid labor has brought a multiple workloads for most women in most countries, because it's still mainly women that take care of the household, take care of children and of elderly people, and on top of it have the job. So this multiple workload has also come with globalization for women. There is a very strong increase of female migration for jobs that was not visible decades ago. And with that, we also have an increase of sex trafficking, abuse, and prostitution. And the networks for sex trafficking have become much more global and much more connected. So that's also a negative effect of globalization for women. However, there has been a lot of progress has been made in the fields of education and health. Thanks to women's rights movement, but also thanks to international organizations and to governmental policies in many countries, and also thanks to global efforts. So there has been progress as well. This is a map, well, several maps of the Gender Inequality Index of 2013. The middle map, the big one in the middle here, is the Gender Inequality Index. So basically that index measures reproductive health of women. So they look at maternal mortality and teenage pregnancy rates. They also look at women's secondary school attendance and women representation in parliament. And they look at women's share in labor force. So they basically look at how the situation of women is in terms of health, in terms of education, in terms of political and economic participation. As you can see, the red countries are the ones that are the most unequal. So they're mostly on the African continent, and most of the orange ones as well. Europe, Northern Europe, and Canada are the more equal ones in terms of gender inequality index. But you see in the other maps that some these are other indexes or other measures. Like here, for example, you have women's share in parliamentary seats, and here you can see that the American continent, especially Latin America, is doing much better than the rest of the world, and the African continent is actually also better off than big parts of the world. So there is more representation of women in government, in parliament, in these parts of the world. The Arabic part of the world are the worst off. Yeah, you can look at the other maps if you're interested. Here you have the maternal mortality ratio, adolescent fertility rate, share of women and girls in labor force, and share of women with secondary education. This was 2013. Okay, so now just a quick case study. Obviously, South Africa is a good case study in terms of inequality. On the one hand, because it has one of the highest Gini indexes, meaning that it is one of the most unequal countries in the world, but also because it really has the gender and the race and the class factors that are very prominent and that are interlinked. So this is an article by Edward Webster, who is professor at Wits University, that was published in 2017. So as I said, or what he also says, that South Africa is one of the most unequal societies in the world, and that actually the top 10 of the population earn about 60% of the income of the whole country. So the Gini index is still at 0.66. Same as it was in the early 1990s. So there has actually not been an advance or progress made in terms of inequality since the end of apartheid. Race, class, and gender, and especially their intersectionality, their overlapping, are key to understand the inequality. And just a few facts to show it. In terms of gender, Black women continue to carry the burden of low-paid work. So you have 80% of domestic workers are Black women, and 66% of community service workers as well. All of them earning less than 3,500 Rand per month. And also most unpaid care work for children, for elderly people, is done by women still. In terms of race, and this can maybe be surprising, inequality between members of the same race group has increased and actually exceeded the income inequality between race groups. So putting it into an example, inequality between rich Black people in South Africa and poor Black people in South Africa is bigger than the inequality between Black and white. So this leads us to the next point, which is that social class is actually becoming a more important factor. And looking at income is the one way to look at it, but looking at wealth shows an even clearer picture. So the top 10 of the population own 95% of all wealth in South Africa. And you have almost 80% of the population that own no wealth at all, which are, strong numbers. Questions also to think about. Are you surprised of the percentages of income and wealth inequality, or did you expect them this high? Also, how do you think we can explain this trend that the inequality within the same race is exceeding the inequality between race groups? How do you think, what could be factors that led to this? Also, what do you think are the main problems linked to such a high inequality in South Africa? What do you see? What do you read? What do you hear out there? And last but not least, what do you consider could or should be done to address this inequality? Okay, so moving to our second part of today's lecture, to global humanitarianism. I guess you've all seen these ones. In 2000, the United Nations designed 8 development goals to tackle extreme poverty. The idea was that starting the new millennium, the world and all the countries in the world would commit to tackle extreme poverty by following these 8 goals. And the idea was to reach zero poverty by 2015. In 2015, the goals were not achieved, so that's when they were expanded to these 17 goals to sort of define smaller and more concrete goals. And you also see that there are new goals that are more related to climate change as well, like for example, Goal 12, responsible consumption and production, Goal 13, climate action, even Goal 6 and 7, affordable energy and clean energy. So these are basically the goals that all countries have agreed to, and even all leading development institutions have agreed to work on. Now, looking at different types of global humanitarianism and foreign aid, basically by foreign aid, we really understand any form of assistance that is given by individuals, by corporations, by NGOs, by governments to poorer countries or societies. So there are different types of foreign aid. One type is humanitarian aid. Usually humanitarian aid is really life-saving assistance. So it can be food, it can be crop as well, it can be medical aid, or also emergency aid of different kinds, generally provided in the short term. So when there is a natural catastrophe or when there is a drought. So famous examples are the Red Cross or Médecins Sans Frontières, who are involved also in conflict countries that provide medical aid or other types of emergency aid. Another type, the more dominant type of foreign aid, is development aid, which is also called official development assistance, ODA. This is generally long-term aid that is provided in different forms. It can be loans or grants, it can be project aid, or it can also be technical assistance. So the difference is mostly that humanitarian aid is generally short-term and it's in emergency situations mostly, while official development assistance is usually long-term projects. So what role do NGOs, international NGOs and charity play? Some people see it as a third type of aid, but they're really rather actors, and they're often the ones that actually implement the type of aid. So for example, the Red Cross and Médecins Sans Frontières are international NGOs that implement the humanitarian aid. And you also often have official development assistance that is provided by governments that is also on the grassroots level implemented by local organizations. So these types of aid can either be bilateral, so that means they go from a donor government directly to a receiving government. That means, for example, the UK gives money to Ghana for whatever development purposes. Or they can also be multilateral, so basically through institutions like the UN or the IMF, or even through economic institutions like BRICS, that can provide funds to certain countries or even to certain groups of countries to receive aid. And the trend has really been towards multilateralism, so you often have countries that join forces and support other countries together, also to sort of avoid doing 5 times the same thing when it can be done in one. Now, foreign aid throughout time, it sort of really started growing in the West in the 1970s, and there was a pledge to increase aid to a 0.7% of national GDP, which would mean that each country would give a 0.7% of their national GDP to foreign aid. It might seem small, but it is actually quite a lot, and most countries are below that. In the 1980s, the aid diminished, and there were much more conditionalities that were attached to the different loans or the different projects, mainly because there was an economic crisis, so the countries were less able or less favorable to giving. In the 1990s, there was sort of a disillusion with aid, so the budgets have also gone down a lot in those times. And in the 2000s, we sort of, with the UN Millennium Development Goals and with different summits and also with famous people, popular people getting more involved in the whole aid industry, there has been a push for more aid again. Okay, now here, quick video where the aid comes from mostly and where it goes mostly.
rich countries are giving away more in aid than at any other time on record. In 2016, more than $140 billion was distributed around the world. According to the latest breakdown, in 2015, America gave the most money away, nearly $31 billion, to at least 40 countries and organizations, such as the World Bank. This included $770 million to Pakistan and $250 million to Mexico. This may sound generous, but the United States has the largest economy in the world. American foreign aid spending in 2015 was only 0.17% of the country's gross national income, far less than other rich countries. Sweden and Norway are the biggest givers, donating over 1% of their gross national income to foreign aid. The biggest receivers of aid in 2015 were Afghanistan, India, Vietnam, Ethiopia and Indonesia. Afghanistan received $3.8 billion and India $3.1 billion. Despite being the second biggest economy in the world, China received $1.5 billion in development aid in 2015. This included around $750 million from Germany and $67 million from Britain. The total amount of foreign aid is at an all-time high, up 9% in 2016. This is largely down to the generosity of 6 countries who meet or exceed the United Nations foreign aid target, donating more than 0.7% of gross national income.
Now, there have been lots of controversies around foreign aid, and one controversy is a very basic one, which is, does it even work? Does foreign aid really provide development? Does it really alleviate poverty? Does it really diminish inequality? So there's one representative on the one side, Jeffrey Sachs, who wrote The End of Poverty, How We Can Make It Happen in Our Lifetime, which became a very famous book. So basically what he argues is that poor countries are stuck in a poverty trap, which is the trap that we looked at before, right? And what he argues is that poverty is often the cause of future poverty because there is little infrastructure, because there's little access to education, to health. This causes poverty again, and people are stuck in poverty. And what he argues is that what is needed is a simultaneous development of human capital, meaning of people, through education, through health, and through entrepreneurship, jobs, and also development of infrastructure at the same time that would sort of get the economy going. So the solution he proposes is what he calls a big push, which would be a very rapid and high increase of the level of foreign aid that would sort of push economies out of that poverty trap. So he's basically the one who suggested the 0.7% of GDP because he argued that if all countries would donate that to foreign aid, it would be possible to end extreme poverty in the world. So that's the one position. On the other hand, we have the complete opposite position. William Easterly is just one example of people who are against foreign aid. What he argues, looking at numbers and statistics, is that the countries that have actually been the most effective in fighting poverty, countries like China, like Malaysia and Singapore, are the ones that received very little aid. So he argues that aid is actually not the one factor that gets countries out of poverty. And he also shows that data from 22 countries that have received aid does not actually show an increase of productivity, a significant one, despite all the millions of money that have been put into the countries. So according to him, there is no evidence in statistics that foreign aid actually does better a country's situation and that it does increase economic performance. And he argues that that's the case even in countries that have been well governed and that have used the money appropriately. So these are really the two sides to the debate of foreign aid. You have people that really support it, that say it is the way out of inequality in the world, it is the way towards a more equal world. And you have people that really say, no, foreign aid is actually damaging the countries because it's creating new dependencies. So looking at the donors, why do donors give? There's obviously a lot of different reasons. One can be the solidarity and the objective to improve lives of less fortunate people. I think that's mainly a reason that individual donors have, specifically donors that give to charities and to NGOs directly that want to sort of give back. You also Donors also give because they want to decrease global inequality and therefore contribute to having more stability, because they realize that inequality leads to instability and more migration and more violence. So there can be a self-interest behind it as well. There is the religious belief in charity and in providing help to the less fortunate. There is also a big part of giving is also a strategy to achieve foreign policy objectives. So it can be different objectives. It can be to assist countries or governments that are like-minded, that are friendly. It can be to advance military or security strategies. So it can be geopolitical interests, like making sure you have a country that is sort of aligned and that is in a strategic region, which is something that happens often with the Arab region. Another objective can also be to promote economic interests, so to boost trade relations, to promote the liberalization, the opening of markets, and to also bring in own corporates into those countries, into those markets. And then also to some extent the spread of own ideologies. I think that was mostly the case during the Cold War, where the West wanted to spread its capitalist ideology, while the Soviet Union wanted to spread a communist ideology, and therefore also invested into countries by giving foreign aid. And another reason can also be as a compensation for past injuries, basically as a compensation for colonialism, for imperialism and exploitation that came with it. There are also some donors that consider it an obligation under international law and according to human rights standards. So in order to align with human rights standards, they consider that it is important to contribute with foreign aid. Now, looking at countries who receive foreign aid, the OECD maintains a list of countries that are eligible for foreign aid, and there have sort of been trending beneficiary countries. So and there has also been a trend to sort of in the past year to withdraw aid a bit more from Latin American countries and focus more on African countries. And even within continents, there are countries that are sort of trending a bit as beneficiaries, either because they're countries who might go through a drought or through some specific problem, or because it's countries that might be poor but that might be rather well governed and stable, so they're usually sort of seen as more eligible for foreign aid. Historically, most of the official development assistance has gone to sub-Saharan Africa, and in most African countries it makes up to 5.5% of the gross national income, so it's quite a lot in many African countries. And if you look at maps or on basically the main beneficiary countries of specific donors, you can see that donor countries have sort of specialized on certain recipients. Like Spain's main focus is on Latin America. The United States focuses a lot on the Middle East. France mainly on Francophone Africa, basically on ex-colonies, and Britain mostly on Commonwealth states. So it's very much related to what used to be colonies of those powers. And during the war on terror, this is maybe also an interesting fact, Iraq and Afghanistan were the ones who received the biggest quantities of foreign aid. For example, in 2005, Afghanistan received 38.5% of its own gross national income in aid. So those countries have received huge quantities during those years. Now, there's lots of different controversies within official development assistance as well, of people that are within it that are also disagreeing on certain things. One, for example, is whether assistance should be tied or untied. In the past, much of the aid was tied to certain economic conditions or to certain policy or governmental conditions, or sometimes it even went as far as to say, we're giving you money for an infrastructure project, for example, but you need to use this and this company to build the bridge, for example, or the airport. And it often used to be corporates or companies from the donor country. So this has been criticized a lot because it was also seen as paving the way for those corporates into new markets. And it would basically force the receiving government to make use of foreign companies and not of local labor, and not to actually build the local industry. So that's one example of tied aid. There are other types as well. There's also been a big debate whether it should be loans or grants. Most bilateral aid now is in form of grants. The difference is that loans have to be paid back, right? And they come with interest rates, even though it might be small interest rates, they have to be paid back, while grants are really just aid that is given. There's also been this distinction of whether the main investment should go to emergency aid, which is basically immediate poverty relief, which is fighting circumstances that are there in the moment, or whether more money should go into long-term projects that promote economic growth. So there has been a debate which one is more sustainable and which one the main focus should be on. There has also been a debate of whether aid should simply go to the poorest countries because it's the ones most in need, or if it should rather go to countries that are well governed, where it's sort of safer to invest the money and to also be sure that the country will make the most out of it and use it in the most effective way. And a last debate within foreign aid is also who should disperse the aid. Should the aid go from government to government, or should it go through international NGOs? Should it go through NGOs, through the private sector? Who should manage the aid? And also, how many steps does it take to really get to the ground, and how much money can possibly get lost on the way there through the different bureaucracies. So that has also been a very big debate. Now, to conclude on this topic, there have been lots of critiques to foreign aid. These are just a few. One big critique is that it creates new dependencies and that countries actually don't get to develop their own market and don't actually get to stand on their own feet because there is this money coming in. Another big critique is that it takes away responsibility of recipient governments. So often aid provides services that should actually be a responsibility of a government. For example, education, health, infrastructure are usually considered public goods that a government should provide. Now, if NGOs, if other governments, if foreign aid steps in, there is not really an incentive for a government to actually take on those responsibilities. So that has been another very big critique. That is also a critique towards NGOs and charity work of like smaller organizations as well. Another big critique is that it is used for geopolitical interests or even for neocolonial practices. So basically what I mentioned, that the interest is to actually have access to resources, have access to markets for own corporates. So basically the idea behind this critique is that really the donor country is actually just trying to open up markets for itself and not actually giving out of a good reason. Which links to the next one, that it has paved the way for multinational corporates. Another critique is also that emergency aid has in certain cases damaged local markets. For example, if there is a drought and there is a lot of food that is brought into a country, it might completely damage the local farmers that are still trying to sell their products, that are still trying to sort of have a small market going. So there have been cases, especially in countries that experience drought often, like Somalia, Ethiopia, where the critique has been that every time that there is a drought, emergency aid comes in. and that it's actually not sustainable, that the world should look for more sustainable ways to guarantee that those droughts do not occur, or that the country is ready to deal with it if it occurs. There have also been cases of sexual abuse, of discrimination, of use of violence against the receiving population. This has especially been the case with emergency aid that goes in after catastrophe. There have unfortunately been lots of reports and cases where the people going in to provide aid have taken advantage. So it's specifically related to sexual abuse. There have been various cases that have been in the news. Another critique that has also been out there is that the way in which some agencies promote foreign aid or fundraise reinforces patronizing stereotypes, that they reinforce the sense of pity that the West might have towards poorer countries, and that it actually does not benefit the way in which we interact on a global level. So World Vision is one of the organizations that have been criticized a lot for that, because of the kind of advertising that they do in order to fundraise for their projects. And another big critique is that there are too many intermediaries that consume too much of the aid. So basically that from the original donor down through the international non-government organization to the local NGO, that there's too many steps where too many people earn a salary, and where there's too much money going into administration and bureaucracy, so that actually very little money goes to the actual beneficiaries. So these are just the main critiques basically to foreign aid. Now to conclude, I just quickly want to touch on South-South cooperation as well. South-South cooperation is the cooperation of developing countries among them without involving the traditionally powerful countries like the US, like Europe. It's something that started in the late 1960s, and it started mostly from Latin America. It was inspired by Latin American scholars, and the idea was really to decrease the dependence from Western economies and to start forging ties among southern countries that would be less based on exploitation, and that would also sort of promote practices and promote processes that are relevant to the development of their own economies. And much of the South-South cooperation consists of trade agreements and capital flows that are also slowly replacing contracts that these countries were having with Western countries. So it is something that is growing and that is contributing to shift of power and of trade relationships in the world. It has therefore sort of become an alternative model for development as well. So you also have institutions like the BRICS, or also countries that are part of the South, that are providing development loans and grants to other countries now as well. So that's also a new development of the past decade, more or less. Now, questions to conclude. Do you consider South-South cooperation a good development? And what are possible benefits, and what are also potential risks, or what are risks that persist even with this kind of cooperation? Okay, now this is everything for today's session. Next week we'll have the tutorial on global humanitarianism. So we'll see a few short videos that show different perspectives and also different criticism towards global humanitarianism. And then next week, Friday, we have the lecture on migration. Readings for this lecture is book chapter 10. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next week.